Hey there, listeners. If you're looking for your next binge-worthy podcast and you like your true crime light on the gore, then you should check out our show, Moms and Murder, a true crime podcast hosted by myself, Mandy, and my dear friend, Melissa. Some of our recent episodes include one about the craziest hotel bombing you've never heard of, the crimes of Lou Pearlman, and even the murder of Selena.
Each week, we give our take on a new true crime story, balancing our delivery of facts and levity while still giving the stories the respect they deserve and making you feel like you're part of our conversation. Moms and Murder covers both the lesser known and the more familiar stories, and there are over 100 episodes to binge. So get started now. Search Moms and Murder on your favorite podcast app and subscribe so you never miss a new episode.
You're listening to Scene of the Crime, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including The Murder in My Family, Missing Persons, 3 Men and a Mystery, Malice, and DNA ID. All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
We can only wonder what the young couple talked about as they made the nearly 3-hour drive from Cahokia, Missouri to Williamsburg, Iowa in Rose's car. Was Roger driving or Rose? Did they have the radio blasting Rose's favorite station, the one emblazoned on the bumper sticker on her car? Were they giggling at the thought of their clandestine getaway, holding hands and laughing? Or was it more serious, with the two talking about Roger's wife and Rose's child, or even her stalker ex-boyfriend? The weekend tryst seemed well planned. Roger and Rose made an effort to go far from their hometown, where someone might see them. Someone might tell Roger's wife. They took care to drive 125 miles to another state to avoid detection. They had both ensured that they would not be interrupted. Roger's wife had been told that he was working that weekend, and Rose's child was being cared for by a friend. They would be able to spend 2 whole nights together somewhere anonymous, away from the prying eyes of friends, family, and colleagues, a rarity in an extramarital affair. But when Rose and Roger reached their destination, their plans hit a snag. They pulled into the Amana Holiday Inn at 2211 U Avenue, just off Interstate 80 in Williamsburg. They got their bags out of Rose's car, a blue 4-door 1977 Chevy Malibu with Missouri plate number PJJ101, and went to check in, leaving the car in the parking lot. We don't know why they selected this hotel. It's unknown whether it was a spontaneous choice, as the hotel was right off the highway exit, or if the young couple had planned on staying at this particular Holiday Inn. As far as we know, neither of them had been there before, and the hotel selection was random. Their registration form reflects that they intended to check out the next day, and they paid for only 1 night. Roger and Rose did not have a reservation, but the spacious hotel had 156 rooms, and it's likely that they assumed that they would have their pick on this Friday night. But when they approached the front desk, they were disappointed to learn that there were not, in fact, any rooms available. The hotel was sold out due to some conferences that were taking place on its premises, one of which was a morticians convention hosted by the Iowa Association of Cemeteries, attended by almost exclusively male funeral home operators and their spouses. This somewhat maudlin event did not seem to bode well for the couple's romantic plans. But then the desk clerk informed them that they were in luck, One room was available after all. Someone who had planned to stay at the Holiday Inn that night had canceled at the last minute. And even better, it was one of the rare king-sized rooms. Roger and Rose were awarded room 260. Here is Tim Trishman, the manager of the hotel.
My name is Tim Trishman. I was the general manager of the Amana Holiday Inn. I took that position in 1978 and left the property in 1992. So I was the general manager in charge during this event. That it was just a cancellation that we received, and the victims, stopped in to see if we had rooms available, and we had that room available.
Roger and Rose checked into room 260 at the Amana Holiday Inn at 7:40 p.m. on September 12, 1980, 5 minutes before sunset. They went straight to their room. At about 7:50 p.m., Rose called her babysitter, Mrs. Shirley Robertson, from the room phone. Again, Tim Trishman.
There was an option, certainly an option for direct dial. If it was a long-distance phone call, those would have been charged to their guest room folio, and there would be a record of that.
Presumably, this call was to check in on Rose's daughter, Rachel. The Robertsons were out at a laundromat and had taken Rachel with them. There are reports that Rose spoke with the babysitter's son and left a message for the Robertsons to call her at the Amana Holiday Inn. Other reports indicate that actually, Rose spoke with the Robertsons' landlady, Thelma Bright, and left a message with her. The call lasted 5 minutes. Whoever Rose spoke to, he or she must have relayed the message to the Robertsons because at 8:31, Rondell Robertson, the babysitter's husband, called the hotel and was put through to room 260. Strangely, no one answered his call. A third call came into the room around 9 p.m., but the male caller was never identified. The couple didn't make any noise that night that anyone noticed. No unusual sounds came from their room. No comings and goings were noted. But something happened in that room that night. Something that to this day, exactly 40 years later, is still not fully understood. Thanks to the cooperation of some members of law enforcement who are still committed to solving this decades-old case, particularly Sheriff Rob Rotter of Iowa County, Iowa, we were given exclusive access to some of the case files in Rose and Roger's unsolved case. Here is Sheriff Rotter.
I'm Sheriff Robert Rotter, Iowa County Sheriff's Office. I've been with the Sheriff's Office since 1990, and my first exposure to this case officially, well, sort of unofficially, was at night when I was working the midnight shifts in the 90s, in the early 90s. This is one of the ways that I passed time. I could grab one of the case reports, which is a very, very voluminous case report, and I would read through the cases.
We also worked with Paul Holes on this case.
I have to give kudos to Sheriff Rotter in terms of how much he has cooperated with working with myself, working with you. His ultimate goal is really to close this case, to identify who killed Roger and Rose.
Unfortunately, the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, or DCI for short, did not agree to provide us with their files, informing us that this case is still under investigation by that agency. But we have some DCI files contained within the materials we were allowed to access by Sheriff Rotter. Accordingly, throughout this podcast, you will hear reference to DCI files and notes relied on by us as we tried to piece together this complicated and confusing case. You will hear interviews with many people who figured heavily into the story, providing details that only insiders could. Our goal with Season 2 of Scene of the Crime is to reopen the discussion surrounding this unsolved case, now 40 years old, in an attempt to push it toward a resolution. Now back to our young lovers, Roger and Rose. At around 8 a.m. the next day, Saturday, September 13th, two hotel maids, Barbara Machado and Sandra Brown, noted the Do Not Disturb sign hung on the knob of the door to room 260. The sign was still there at 10 a.m. At noon, Barbara used her key to open the door after knocking futilely. She knew that sometimes the Do Not Disturb sign is left out by mistake after guests are long gone. Although the door was locked, it was the kind that locked whenever it was closed. None of the internal safety locks, chains, or swing bars were engaged from the inside, she noted. The door opened to a small hallway at a right angle to the door that led directly to the sleeping area of the room. As soon as she opened the door and glanced in, it was immediately apparent to Barbara that the occupants of room 260 had not checked out. This was because personal possessions, including a woman's purse, were sitting on the floor directly in the line of sight from the door. Barbara did not advance far enough into the hallway to see any people. She quietly closed the door and went to tackle a different room. Shortly thereafter, the assistant housekeeper, Ida Block, noted the Do Not Disturb sign was out, but it was past checkout time.
My name is Ida Block, and at the time I was an assistant housekeeper at the inn.
She knew that the couple in the room was supposed to check out that morning. Ida told us,
A disturbed thing hung on the doorknob.
With her were 2 new hotel maids in training who were on their first day on the job. Using her master key that was assigned to each of the members of the cleaning staff, Ida tells us she
opened up the door, and I looked in, and luggage was there. But I didn't go in, so I left, and I think it was after 12.
She figured that the parties staying there were eating or at the pool and had neglected to observe the checkout time as often happened.
We thought they were down swimming.
Or sometimes people checked out but left the Do Not Disturb sign up inadvertently. Tim Trishman told us,
It was very typical. People would leave their Do Not Disturb sign on. It was always the case. And because the hotel was, typically full on weekends, that was a room that we would have been cleaning and renting to someone else and had a reservation the next night.
Tim Trishman went on to explain,
Typically, if someone hadn't checked out, there was supposed to be a call to the room. I believe that happened, and obviously no one answered the phone.
So finally, now that it was well past checkout time of noon, Ida says,
Then somebody wanted to know about that room, and I said, I will go in and check it.
Having been given the go-ahead to enter since no one was answering the room phone, at 1:15, Ida opened the door and entered. Finding the room dark, with the shades drawn and just the dim light from the bathroom providing little visibility, she flipped the light switch right inside the entrance to the room. The light did not work.
I opened up the door, and the light wouldn't go on at the door.
So Ida stepped further into the room, entering the sleeping area, and turned on the desk lamp, which was on the same circuit as the entranceway light. One wonders how long it took poor Ida to register what she was seeing, and it's hard to imagine her shock and horror at the sight before her in the sleeping area of the small hotel room. On the bed, what appeared to be 2 blood-soaked heads attached to bodies that lay under the stained and rumpled bedclothes rested on pillows soaked in dark red blood.
I looked over and saw this big form on the bed, and out I went.
Specifically, what Ida could make out was
a big dark spot like blood.
With remarkable poise and calm, Ida urgently escorted the 2 young maids out of the room and called out to Henry Trumpold, a hotel maintenance worker who was working in the hallway near room 260, replacing vinyl baseboard. Henry didn't know Ida well, but observing her distress, he went in to take a look at what was in room 260. She told us,
I had to make sure I saw what I saw, right? I mean, that was kind of a shock to me.
Henry confirmed to Ida that indeed it looked as though the young couple was dead. Ida went to the room next door, which was empty, and used the phone to call the front desk. She reached the hotel manager, Tim Trishman. She told him,
I called him and said, I think they're dead.
Tim asked her if she had taken the pulses of the bodies in the bed. She had not. Ida had been focused on getting herself and her 2 trainees out of there. She says,
We didn't tell anybody right away, what happened, because we didn't want anybody to get scared.
Here is Tim Trishman.
I was there that day, but I didn't get involved initially until, we were alerted that there was a problem. And then my front office manager and myself went to the room. I didn't go far into the room. The room was in disarray.
Tim Trishman told us of the experience.
There was nothing quite like this, but I was involved with several suicides. It's, a terrible fact of life that, hotels seem to be the point for sometimes bad things happening. And so I was involved with several instances thereafter, but nothing quite like this, not a double homicide.
This was no suicide. It was clear to everyone that the occupants of room 260 were dead and that something very bad had happened there. Tim kept everyone out of the room and called the Iowa County Sheriff's Department, and thus began the investigation into the murders of Rose Berkert and Roger Atkison.
Jody Loomis, Jessica Baggin, Kelly Ann Prosser, Michelle Martinko, Christy Mirak, Carolyn Rose. Do these names mean anything to you? All these people are murder victims whose cases were cold for decades, until recently. They were solved by investigative genetic genealogy. This new crime-solving tool is rapidly providing us with the names of elusive killers. But each one of these cases is unique and worth exploring. Each episode of the DNA ID podcast will focus on one newly solved case and look at the story behind the headline. Who was the victim? Who was their killer? And why did this tragic crime occur? It's brought to you by AbJack Entertainment, hosted and produced by me, Jessica Betancourt, and co-produced by Mike Morford. Make sure you subscribe to DNA ID today, wherever you listen to podcasts, so you don't miss a single episode.
Let's take a step back from the discussion of the murders for a moment to get an understanding of who our victims were. Roger Edward Atkison, age 32, was born on May 30th, 1948, to parents James Hiram Atkison and Ruth Elizabeth Atkison of St. Joseph, Missouri. He had 6 brothers and sisters. Roger was the third oldest. Here is his brother Larry.
Family-wise, there was 7 of us, 3 boys and 4 girls. And my dad worked at Swift & Company as a slaughter packing house all his life, things like that. So, hard-working, just middle-class people.
Roger's siblings were Larry Atkison, the oldest, Elizabeth Atkison, who went by Betty, and whose married name was Smith, Robin Atkison, another brother, Rita Atkison, who married a man we are calling Mike H., Elaine Atkison, married name Owens, and Wanda Atkison Thomas. The large family was quite religious, and Roger grew up attending church regularly. He was also a Vietnam vet who had served in the Navy. At the time of his death, he worked as a telephone installer and repairman for General Telephone and Electronics Corporation, which we will refer to as GTE, based in Savannah, Missouri. Roger's family tells us that Roger was unassuming, on the quiet side, sensitive, and well-liked. He had no enemies that they knew of. He didn't do drugs, get into fights, get into legal scrapes, or drink regularly or to excess. Here is his wife, Marcella.
Well, Roger was a very friendly person. He seemed like he never met a stranger. He easily took up a conversation with people. I kind of described him as a real friendly little puppy dog that you wagged his tail and licked your hand and was just so overly friendly. And so he was liked by many people that I know of. I mean, he was very popular with people as far as personable and likable.
Roger had been married to his wife, Marcella Hatcher Atkison, for 7 years. They had just observed their wedding anniversary on September 1st. The couple lived in St. Joseph, Missouri, and had no children. In fact, an adoption the couple had pursued had recently fallen through. Roger and Marcella met at Bible camp as teens and started dating when Marcella was just 15. They also both attended Benton High School, although Roger was 3 years ahead of Marcella. When they married, Roger was working for Beacon's Move All Moving and Storage Company, employed by his in-laws Floyd and Nellie Hatcher, who owned the St. Joseph branch of the moving company. Marcella was a senior at Missouri Western College, where she was majoring in social work. Roger was clean-cut and mainstream as a kid. He had a stamp collection, played the piano, and competed in swimming. As an adult, Roger enjoyed typical pastimes like fishing and hanging out with the guys, and he and Marcella led a morally upstanding lifestyle, which was somewhat ironic, as we shall soon see. Marcella was staunchly opposed to drinking or smoking. Roger did not smoke, or, to Marcella's knowledge anyway, drink, and the two were the co-chairs of the St. Joseph chapter of a group that advocated for non-smokers' rights. The couple was also among the parishioners of the King Hill Baptist Church, in which they were very active, attending services regularly. Roger sang in the choir and drove the church bus and was close with his pastor. Roger was also interested in studying alternative energy. He and Marcella joined the Solar Energy Club, and Roger was working on building a solar energy machine in his garage constructed of 3,000 empty aluminum cans. Here is Marcella.
Well, we established the St. Joseph Non-Smokers' Rights Group there in St. Joseph. It didn't last very long, but that we were founding members of that and led that for a while. We also belonged to the Solar Energy Club in St. Joe, and I believe he was some kind of officer in the next club, the next step up, and I think that was Kansas City. But we were active in that Non-Smokers' Rights Club. We were active in the Solar Energy Club, and he was, I believe he was the vice president in the local Solar Energy Club.
When Roger died, he was 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighed 175 pounds, had brown hair, and wore glasses. He had a scar on his chin that he got when his older brother Larry taught him to ride a bike as a child. Rosetta Burkert was born on May 21, 1958, to parents Frederick and Marjorie in St. Joseph, Missouri. Rose joined a very complicated blended family. Her mother, Marjorie, had previously been married to a man named James Thomas Halter. James and Marjorie had 5 children: James Clarence Halter, who was known as J.C., Joe Halter, Catherine Halter, Christina Halter, and Margie Halter Lowry. These were all half-siblings of Rose's. Marjorie left James and married Fred Burkert, and the two had Rose together. Fred already had children from a previous marriage, more half-siblings of Rose's. These were William Burkert, Robert Burkert, and Cynthia Burkert. But when Rose was about 10 years old in 1967, Marjorie left Fred and married again, this time to a man named Lyle Tharp. And Lyle was Rose's uncle by marriage. He was Marjorie's ex-husband Fred's sister's husband. To his marriage with Marjorie, Lyle brought his sons from a previous marriage, one named Emery, and one whom we will refer to only by his first initial, K. Fred Burkert also remarried to a woman named Betty Jo, who became Rose's stepmother. Rose was very close to Fred and Betty, whom she affectionately called Bet. Fred and Bet lived in the house next door to Rose when she died. In fact, when Marjorie had married Lyle, there were complicated and drawn-out custody proceedings that resulted in a trial to determine who should be awarded custody of the kids. Marjorie had been reported to the Division of Family Services for her neglect of the children, at least once that we know of. According to Rose's sisters, Lyle was also a reason behind this report to DFS. He was emotionally abusive, had at least one violent episode, and had a record as a cattle rustler. He and Marjorie were allegedly engaged in other illegal activities as well. DFS got involved. The kids sided with Fred in the custody dispute, and things got contentious. Rose also resented her mother for leaving her father, Fred. and some of Marjorie's other children did not have positive relationships with their mother. Rose's family told us that Marjorie was the kind of person who constantly put everyone else down and whom they could not trust. So, with the kids' support, even though Fred was the biological father only of Rose, he was awarded custody of Rose as well as of Marjorie's 5 other children, Rose's half-siblings from Marjorie's previous marriage to James Halter, who were still minors. To make matters more complicated, Rose's half-sister Christina went on to marry Lyle Tharp's son, Kay, even though the two were technically step-siblings. Fred died in 1978 when Rose was 20. She also lost another brother, William Burkert, in 1976 when he was electrocuted in a work-related accident. Rose lived her entire life in St. Joseph. Rose left the family home to live on her own when she was fairly young, moving in with friends and eventually renting a place next door to her dad and stepmom off Highway 169, right outside St. Joseph in Avenue City. At the time of her death, Rose was young, only 22, 10 years younger than her married lover. She was 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 130 pounds, with long, dark, wavy hair. Rose had a daughter, Rachel, age 2, whose father was not involved in the child's life. When she died, Rose had just left her job of 3 years working as a nurse's aide at Laverna Village Nursing Home. She was due to begin her new job at Methodist Hospital in Savannah on Monday, September 15th. Rose was described by coworkers and friends as someone who was funny, pleasant, and friendly, but who hadn't been too lucky in love. A lot of the information we learned about Rose was provided by her sister.
My name is technically Marjorie Lowry. I go by Margie. I was Rosie's sister. I left home before she was killed, but still got to see her on holidays, vacations, and or whatever else. We were just a basic family. At the time that she grew up, she was like any other female. She was looking for someone who she hoped would come Mr. Right, but she didn't find Mr. Right.
The first news story about the murders that we were able to find was a short piece in the Cedar Rapids Gazette dated the 13th of September, which would have had to be the evening edition of the paper, since it was the same day the bodies were found. The article reported that the 2 people had been hacked to death with an axe-like instrument in their room at the Amana Holiday Inn. The article identified Rose and Roger by name and cited investigators' statements that neither guns nor drugs were involved in the murders. Police refused to confirm the nature of the murder weapon, but the paper reported that relatives of the slain couple had been informed by authorities that they were the victims of a hatchet murder, having apparently been attacked while they slept. As more and more information was revealed over the coming days and weeks about the gruesome murders that took place at the Amana Holiday Inn, the public was increasingly shocked and disturbed. According to DCI Director Gerald Shanahan, Iowa had only 2.2 murders for every 100,000 inhabitants in 1979, compared with the national average of 9.7 murders. This type of violent, vicious crime just didn't happen in the idyllic rural state, or at least it hadn't since the Villisca Axe murders of 1912. And it didn't impact just the public at large. The rarity of the bloody double murder, the distinctiveness of the crime scene, and the mysteriousness of the circumstances would stick with investigators for years to come. Paul Holes commented wryly,
"It's rare. It's very rare."
As for the crime at the hotel itself, Tim Trishman says over the years there were just the typical things one sees in the hotel industry.
Nothing of this magnitude. Prior to that, we had an armed robbery. It was during pheasant hunting season, the year or two before. It was not uncommon to see people walking around with shotguns because they were hunting. And it was late at night, and someone robbed the night auditor. I don't remember what year that was. No one was hurt. No one was ever found. No one was brought to justice. So other than that, some domestics that you always have in hotel situations, but certainly nothing of this scale.
And as reports of the murders circulated among the community members in and around St. Joseph, news of the illicit affair between a married man and a much younger woman who had a young child out of wedlock shocked people almost as much as the news of the murders. A high school friend of Rose's who was interviewed by the St. Joseph News Press said, "Since the thing came out in the news, I've been hearing all kinds of rumors. They make it sound like she was a bad woman, fooling around. I knew her pretty well. She never was one to go around with the wild crowd. She didn't do drugs and she wasn't a real partygoer." The uniqueness of the hotel room crime scene is what makes the murders of Roger and Rose such a bizarre and intriguing case. Here is Paul Holes.
There's something odd about this crime scene, about this offender's behavior. What is going on here?
The crime scene was secured by the Iowa County Sheriff's Office under the auspices of Sheriff William Spurrier, who responded personally to the scene, arriving between 1:45 and 1:50 p.m. Spurrier had been Iowa County Sheriff for 22 years, and he had seen a few things over the course of his career. Before even getting to the Holiday Inn, the sheriff had requested the assistance of the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation, or DCI. He also called the assistant medical examiner, Dr. Virginia Moldenhauer, at her home. Remember, this was a Saturday, and they drove together to the hotel. They were the first law enforcement personnel to enter the room, and what they observed told them that they were about to have a very long day. As Ida had noted, the drapes were pulled closed over the windows on the far wall of the room, and it was quite dark. And once the drapes were opened, illuminating the room, authorities could see that blood was spattered all over the headboard of the bed. The walls and pictures hanging on them were sprayed with blood. Blood had splashed onto the carpet, and the two bodies on the bed, with mangled skulls and blood-soaked limbs, were very, very dead. We looked at the actual crime scene reports and notes taken by deputies, officers, and agents from all responsive law enforcement organizations. Here's what DCI Criminalistics lab technicians Mike Peterson and Bob Monserrat found when they pored over room 260. When one entered room 260, a 6 to 8 foot hallway led to the right. A door on the left end of the hallway led to the small bathroom and closet area. At the end of the hallway, it opened up into the sleeping area of the room. A TV stand was on the right, with a large 1980s TV set with antenna on it. Contrary to contemporary reports, Ida Block tells us that the TV was not on. Next to this, a pale carved desk with a lamp on it graced the right-hand wall, and then a small hexagonal table was in the far right corner. On the left wall of the room, the wall that was the exterior wall of the hotel, not abutting any rooms, was the king-sized bed, the carved headboard that matched the desk up against the opposite wall. On either side of the bed was a similarly matching end table and lamp. 3 dining-style chairs with upholstered seats and wooden backs were also in the room. 2 had arched backs and wooden arms, and one, which was probably the desk chair, had a straight back and no arms. The back wall of the room was covered with brown and white curtains, matching the bedspread, which were drawn closed. The bathroom was a very typical hotel bathroom: small sink with a mirror, toilet, bathtub with a shower attachment, and curtain. Investigators discovered that 2 bodies lay on the bed. They were clearly deceased. The woman lay face up and the man lay face down. The backs of their heads, his visible, hers apparent only once she was turned over, were slashed and chopped open by something sharp and heavy. They had been lying face down when the blows occurred. The upper portion of the bed was soaked in blood, and the female's long, loose hair was saturated and wild. Blood was spattered throughout the room, mostly on the wall over the bed and the headboard. The male corpse was dressed only in his boxer shorts. His right arm was up over his head, with his elbow bent. His right wrist had deep cuts, and several of the fingers on his right hand were wounded, and one was entirely severed. On his left hand was also a deep cut, telling investigators that the victim, undoubtedly awake at the time of the attack, had put his hands up by his head to try to protect himself from the blows. Chunks of his hair, cut off by the blade as it struck his skull, lay stuck to his right arm and hand, dried in the blood. The female's upper body was almost totally covered by the bedclothes, with her elbow visible through a hole in the comforter, while the man's upper torso was exposed. What was strange was that the woman had been turned over after the fatal wounds were inflicted on the back of her head. When the bodies were found, she lay on her back. Her bloody hair lay across part of her pale, blood-stained face in a macabre image. She had cuts on her right arm near her elbow. Unlike the male victim, she was fully dressed. Here are the exact observations of DCI criminalist Michael Peterson, who inspected the murder scene, as recorded in the Iowa County Sheriff's files.
The bed was a king-size bed, on which were the bodies of a man and a woman. The man was lying face down on the left side of the bed, the woman face up in the approximate center of the bed. A large amount of blood was soaked into the pillows and spattered on the headboard and wall. Both victims were covered, the female covered up to the neck, and the male covered to the approximate center of his back. The covers consisted of a bedspread and sheet, and it was noted that the covers were tucked under the right side of the female and then draped over her body and the body of the male. It was also noted that some hair of the male and female was joined, held together by blood. Upon uncovering the victims, it was noted that the male was clothed only in a pair of undershorts and the female was clothed fully except for bare feet.
Neither body displayed any evidence of being restrained. No ligatures, bindings, or gags appeared to have been used to subdue, restrain, or quiet the couple. It was as though they had lain still on the bed and allowed the blows to rain down on them, with only Roger seeming to attempt to defend himself by shielding his head with his hands. This futile effort implies that he was awake when he was killed. Roger and Rose were quickly identified by Iowa County Sheriff's deputies from their IDs found in room 260. They notified St. Joseph detectives that 2 of their citizens had been found deceased in an evident homicide. As she told us earlier, Ida and some other maids had noted the Do Not Disturb sign on the door to room 260 on the morning of the 13th. No activity was noted at all that day. There were no signs of a forced entry to room 260. Evidence of any kind of a struggle was non-existent. It appeared that Roger and Rose had in no way anticipated the terrible fate about to befall them. Roger and Rose's personal items were largely found to be on the floor, although some clothing was found to be hanging in the closet. On the carpeted floor in front of the desk, between the end of the bed and the right-hand wall of the room, was a white leather bag. 2 Q-tips lay on the ground nearby. An orange blanket spilled off the end of the bed. Under the desk area, where there was no chair, was Rose's tan purse lying on its side with the contents such as a pink brush, a blue comb, and a tube of chapstick falling out. Next to it was a hot lather machine, a device that warms shaving cream so that the person using a razor can achieve a closer shave, and some items of clothing. On top of the desk, in front of the mirror, were men's toiletries, a man's black comb, and a set of keys, as well as deodorant and a bottle of VO5 shampoo. Rose's side of the bed was the side closer to the bathroom wall. The space between the wall and the bed was only about 2 to 3 feet. Between the bed and the wall was a nightstand which matched its partner on Roger's side. The phone receiver was in its cradle. On the floor near this nightstand were 2 suitcases and a pair of boots. These things were not stacked neatly. Rather, they were lying on the floor in a somewhat haphazard manner, and their contents lay splayed out, seemingly having been rifled through. This led investigators to report that the room had been ransacked, but it did not appear that anything had been taken, although later it was determined that approximately $200 in cash was missing from Roger's billfold. This was cash that he had been given by his company, GTE, for travel expenses for the 2-week job in Cahokia. There were reports early on that an address book owned by Rose had been taken from the room by the assailant. These reports even appeared in newspaper articles about the case. But this wasn't true. DCI agent Richard Gregory specifically told Buchanan County Sheriff's Deputy Howard Judd on the 13th via telephone that they had located the female victim's address book in the room. Bizarrely, Rose's intact tan wallet, car keys, a pair of glasses, and a deck of playing cards wrapped in a rubber band were all found on Rose's side of the bed, placed partially under the left-hand side of her pillow, just inches from her bloody head. The items appeared to have been there the whole time, as blood droplets are visible on the wallet in the crime scene photos. But on Roger's side of the bed, things were even more bizarre. The lamp on his nightstand was off. Both drawers of the nightstand were wide open. Minute traces of blood spatter had sprayed on the surfaces of the nightstand, as well as inside the open top drawer. 2 of the dining chairs, the third remaining placed at the table in the corner of the room, were found to have been placed next to Roger's side of the bed. Their deliberate placement gave the impression that 2 people had pulled the chairs over to have a seat and chat with Roger as he lay in the bed. One of the chairs, the one with arms, had a white bath towel draped over the back and seat, as if someone who was sitting on the chair did not want to make contact with the chair itself. This towel displayed numerous small blood spots. One match was missing from the book of matches in the drawer with another ashtray. Furthermore, on the floor on Roger's side, in front of the chairs where it seemed likely that at least one person had been seated, were scattered business cards, receipts, and other items that appeared to have been taken from Roger's wallet and discarded on the floor. Dr. Moldenhauer noted that while many cards and wallet contents were on the floor, a Sears charge card, Missouri State Mental Health ID card, and the room key were all on the dresser. The wallet itself, with one of those clear plastic accordion-like card holder inserts, was ripped apart and thrown on the floor as well. Checks also were scattered on the floor next to the nightstand. Interestingly, the police reports indicate that investigators concluded that the victim's personal belongings had been ransacked prior to the commission of the homicides. This could be inferred because of the blood spatter found on the items found on the floor near the bed. It was noted that there were blood-like drops that were small on the items that had been left by the leg of the chair that had a towel on it, indicating that the perpetrator was going through these items prior to the murders. What on earth had occurred in room 260, whereby Roger and Rose stood quietly by as someone or someones rifled through their possessions, destroyed some of them, and discarded them on the floor? But that's not all. Someone, everyone presumed it was the killer, had ground or smashed a small bar of hotel soap into the carpet, leaving orange soap shards all over the floor on Roger's side of the bed. Let's discuss the bathroom, because it revealed perhaps the strangest evidence of all. A hotel towel was found draped on the bathroom sink and another on the bathroom floor. The towel on the sink had bloody residue on it, having apparently been used to wipe off the murder weapon. Still another small white towel with tan, possibly bloody residue on it was crumpled up in the tub. Further, diluted bloodstains were found on and in the sink and on the floor around the sink, an indication that the killer had washed up. DCI agents' notes from the crime scene note that a bath-sized bar of orange soap and a small bar of cream-colored hand soap were missing from the bathroom. Wrappers from soap bars were shredded on the bathroom floor and the bedroom floor. The cream-colored bar was never found. The missing orange bar was believed to be the one mashed up on the bedroom carpet. But there were more strange aspects of the scene in the bathroom. Someone had used something like soap or chapstick to write the word "this" on the upper left corner of the mirror on the back of the bathroom door. It appeared to officers processing the scene that an entire message had been written on the mirror in white soap and everything erased except the word "this." The letter S in the word appeared to slant backwards, hinting that perhaps the killer had been left-handed. Here is Sheriff Rotter with his thoughts on this oddity.
The bathroom is a little bit messed up. There's blood in the sink that you can see has been diluted with water. One of the weird things that we dealt with from then and to this day is the idea that somebody had wrote in soap on the door the word "this." And whether or not that has anything to do with our case or not, we don't know. We've never been able to ascertain what that was supposed to mean. There's always a possibility that it was there to begin with and has nothing to do with this. It could be something that the murderer did just to throw out some things to distract. It's really hard to say.
But since Sheriff Rotter made these comments, we received some more information on the writing on the mirror from Ida Block, the assistant housekeeper at the hotel. She tells us that, quote, "All rooms were checked by the head housekeeper after they were cleaned. All mirrors were always cleaned, even the slightest water drop. It sounds to us as though it is very likely that this writing was fresh, and it was, indeed, the killer who wrote the cryptic message on the mirror." A tube of Crest toothpaste had been placed inside a tissue holder on the toilet tank. DCI notes reflect that agents believe the tube was possibly smashed with a fist, although later Paul Holes said it looked as though it had just been squeezed. And, strangest of all, toothpaste from that tube of Crest was found squirted into the bathtub, mint green curls of it lying in multiple small piles on the tub's bottom and side. Toothpaste was also found squirted inside the tissue holder. Paul Holes pondered the toothpaste and whether it was a clue or a red herring.
The toothpaste, by just looking at Rose and Roger's case, that was something I did focus in on and the big question is this something that the offender did, or is this something that had happened prior to the offender entering into the room for whatever reason? Rose and Roger, they're in the shower, they have the toothpaste out and they squirt it out. Or is this potentially an indicator that the offender came in when Rose and or Roger were brushing their teeth and holding the toothpaste tube in their hand, and during the combat, the tube got squeezed, and now you got toothpaste being, deposited in the bathtub. So it was something that it was interesting, but there was multiple explanations I could think of by just taking a look at Rose's and Roger's case by itself.
Again, here is criminalist Michael Peterson's report. Note the items that he documented, which gives us some insight into those aspects of the crime scene that he found most significant.
A Do Not Disturb sign was hung on the outside doorknob of the room. Clothing was hanging on the clothes bar behind the door. A white hand towel was on the floor behind the door and appeared to have been rolled and placed under the door. The bathroom door was open. The word "this" was printed on the bathroom door, and it appeared as if the printing had been wiped. 2 stained towels were in the bathroom, one on the sink and the other on the floor. The trash can under the sink was empty, except for a toilet courtesy seal. The wrappers from 2 bars of soap were on the floor. No soap was found in the bathroom, however. What appeared to be a diluted blood stain was noted on the edge of the sink, and similar appearing stains were noted on the floor by the stool. A tube of toothpaste, the lid from which was in the ashtray on the sink vanity, was found in the tissue dispenser. Toothpaste was noted on the tissue in the dispenser. The bathtub was dry. The shower curtain was open, and the bath mat was hanging over the curtain rod. Toothpaste was noted on the bottom of the tub. No pattern could be recognized. The sleeping area of the room was in disarray, with clothing and personal belongings strewn on the floor. Miscellaneous clothing and 2 suitcases were piled on the floor at the right side of the bed. On the floor at the foot of the bed and under the desk were a blanket, a lady's purse with contents dumped out, an empty man's wallet, and a gym bag which apparently once contained a man's toiletries. The floor on the left side of the bed was found to be littered with miscellaneous papers, the picture section of a man's wallet, and fragments of soap. The crime scene, it should be noted, is consistent with the victim's personal belongings being gone through or ransacked prior to the commission of the homicides. Both drawers of the lamp table on the left side of the bed were open. 2 plastic drinking glasses were on the lampstand, both dry, one of which was upside down. A checkbook, disassembled, was on the lampstand, and it was noted that the top check had been scribbled on with soap. 2 chairs were pulled up to the left side of the bed, on one of which a white towel was draped. Numerous small blood spots were noted on the towel. No blood was noted on the second chair.
It was on this checkbook, scribbled on with soap, that investigators would find a latent fingerprint that they assumed came from the killer, and they used going forward to eliminate suspects. It was the only usable print found at the scene. Note that the criminalist observed that the items from Roger's wallet that were found on the floor close to the chair with the towel on it were covered in blood droplets. Initial media reports were that the couple was killed while they slept, but the blood spatter analysis showed that this was incorrect. The killer had ransacked Roger's wallet before hacking his victims to death. Surely he had not slept through someone sitting next to his bed tearing up his possessions. Sheriff Rotter shared with us his thoughts on the soap shards found all over the carpet next to Roger's side of the bed.
The soap doesn't really concern me too much just because we know that the person cleaned up in the bathroom. I mean, that's obvious because of the diluted blood that's on the sink and on the basin. And they obviously used the soap because that was the soap that was from the room. And my thought is, back in 1980, we're not worried about DNA. We're worried about fingerprints. And if I was the killer, you might question, can I leave a fingerprint on a bar of soap? Well, I'm not going to take that chance. So I think they take the soap out and just step on it several times and basically pulverize it into the carpet, taking away that possibility. So that's my guess as to why that took place. I think they wanted to make sure they didn't leave any fingerprints behind, and they did that. They did that very well.
Paul Holes talked about the unique aspects of this crime scene and the bizarre clues left behind by the killer.
Those become a focus in terms of why are those oddities there? And it's so hard sometimes to answer that question because it's interpreting tea leaves, but you have to look at that because, you think about your typical gang shooting or your typical DV homicide, which is, or drug related homicide. Those 3 are the ones that law enforcement typically handles. And you don't have oddities like what we see in this crime scene. So it is something that has to be dug into, and there's multiple explanations for any of it, but it's as what I call the stack of behaviors start to build up, it starts to give at least what I would consider a primary investigative direction that I have to pursue until that dead ends.
Room 260 was on the second and top floor of the Amana Holiday Inn in the south wing of the hotel. It had one door leading to the internal hallway of the hotel. The maids referred to room 260 as the bridal suite because of its remoteness and king-sized bed. The hotel is laid out in a square shape around a courtyard, and room 260 was at the corner, catty corner from where the lobby is. In other words, room 260 was literally as far away from the busy lobby and front desk area as possible. It was also on an outside wall of the hotel in a small alcove off the long hallway, meaning that it only had one room next to it, room 262. The other rooms in the hotel were generally bordered by two rooms. Rooms 260 and 262 were set apart from all the others on the second floor, the only two rooms with such positioning on the entire second level. And down the flight of stairs, right around the corner from room 262, was an exit door that led to a short breezeway to the second building of the hotel and the walkway to the parking lot. Here is Paul Holes.
The front lobby, right there, facing the freeway. And then on the western side, right off of the parking lot, right by, on the first floor, right underneath the room, there was another door. And so guests could go in either way and get access to the room where Rose and Roger were killed.
Paul described the room's location within the hotel as almost the perfect location for such a crime, as though it had been selected for the purpose. Now for the setting. Williamsburg, Iowa is a small farming town. It lies amidst flat plowed fields and is accessible by straight rural roads. At the time of the murders, its population was 2,033. The town is located along Interstate 80, a major roadway that runs all the way from California to New Jersey, passing through several major cities along its route. The Holiday Inn is just off exit 225 and lies about 5 miles east of Williamsburg. This area where the hotel was located was known as Little Amana and offered lodging, shops, and restaurants to tourists coming to visit the Amana colonies. These colonies were a series of 7 historic reenactment-type villages that pay homage to the German heritage of the area's Amish settlers. Here is Iowa County Sheriff Rob Rotter.
The Amana colonies, where this is close to, is a tourist destination, has been for a long time, and the crime is pretty low. Murders just simply don't happen, and to have a double murder this style is pretty crazy for that neck of the woods. I did grow up in Amana. I would have been 12 years old when the murders took place, and I remember it quite well when it occurred. So the thought that I would someday be working on this case officially this many years later is pretty incredible.
Roger and Rose had told some of their friends and associates that the Amana colonies was their destination on that fateful weekend. Here is Paul Holes telling us about the hotel.
It was a very interesting property. You mentioned character, and this hotel had character in spades back in the day. It was in some ways, I hate to use the term resort, but it was sort of a resort-like location for families, parents with their kids that are traveling to be able to stop off there. It had a water slide park area in the center part of it. But it was right off the freeway. It's just south of the freeway. You take an off-ramp coming from either the east or western directions, and you go south and you could see it from the freeway. The rooms, this kind of was sort of a squared off horseshoe shaped. And the parking lot, of course, was in front of the hotel, which is facing the freeway on the north side. But you could also park on the western side, which is where the room where Rose and Roger were found was located at. But going around the eastern side of the hotel, there was an open area that was really kind of more for the hotel employees, as well as that's where the maintenance and service aspects were, with the sheds that had all the equipment they needed to maintain the grounds, as well as, the various additional tables and chairs and stuff. So the hotel itself was really surrounded by asphalt, either to park on or to be able to go to the back of the hotel.
The Iowa County Medical Examiner, Dr. Stacy Howell, arrived at room 260 at 2:30 p.m. on the 13th. He inspected the bodies and supervised their removal for autopsy. In what must have been a horrible experience for each of them, Roger's brother Larry Atkison and Rose's sister Marjorie Lowry were required to identify the bodies of their deceased loved ones. The memory of this traumatic event still reduces Margie to tears 40 years later. Here she describes how the experience was.
Terrible.
Autopsies on the victims were performed at St. Luke's Hospital in Cedar Rapids on September 14th between 8:50 and 11:35 a.m. Dr. Regis Wieland performed the autopsy on the body of Roger Atkison. Dr. William McNeil performed the autopsy of Rose Berkert. DCI agents who observed the autopsy documented the following findings.
Atkison received 7 deep lacerations of the left center of the rear portion of his head, each sufficient enough to fracture the skull. These vary between 10 centimeters and 3 centimeters in length. On the right hand, he had 5 lacerations with his little finger totally removed. Cuts were apparently made by a broad object with a sharp edge. A linear bruise measuring approximately 8 centimeters, 3.25 inches, was noted on his back. Another bruise was found on his left rear shoulder. The autopsy report postulates that these 2 linear brown marks have the appearance of a sharp object striking the body with bed clothing in between so that it leaves merely a linear bruise but no cutting.
Roger also had 3 chop marks measuring between 1.5 and 3.5 centimeters on the back of his left shoulder. Investigators wondered if perhaps the killer was reaching over the bed to get to Rose and hit Roger on the shoulder. Roger's death certificate indicates that he would likely have died within 2 to 5 minutes of the fatal blows being inflicted. The date of death is reflected as September 12th or 13th of 1980. The homicide was the result of multiple penetrating wounds to the posterior head. The time of death listed on the death certificate shows how little the autopsy was able to determine, between the hours of 7:40 p.m. and 1 p.m. Here are the notes on Rose's autopsy.
Rose Berkert had 12 deep lacerations in the right center of the rear portion of her skull, each sufficient enough to fracture the skull. She also had a contusion to the brain.
Rose had chop wounds on both sides of her head, near the ears, as well as all over the back of her skull. These were more scattered and erratic than the horizontal wounds on Roger's skull. In other words, they line up in all different directions. Some of Rose's wounds are as long as 9 centimeters.
She further had 5 lacerations about the right forearm. One of these lacerations was approximately 2.5 inches on the front portion of her forearm, right below the bend of the elbow. The rest were lower on the arm. She further received 3 lacerations in the upper scapula area. Total of 8 body lacerations on her right shoulder and across the upper forearm. Sharp linear bruises measuring approximately 8 centimeters, 3.25 inches, were noted on the back of her right upper arm. She had quite a few bruises on the back of her left hand, including an 8-centimeter one that had a shallow laceration at the end of it.
These bruises on Rose's hand were not associated with any identifiable chop wounds, according to the report. Observers wondered maybe someone had roughly grabbed Rose by the hand. Some of the autopsy findings are a little delicate, but are important, so we will share them here.
Samples of blood, bile, and head hair were collected. The stomach was empty, and the vagina was contaminated with fecal matter. There was no appearance of seminal fluid content in the vaginal area.
The autopsy report noted that both victims had a low amount of stomach content. It was estimated that they died 3 to 6 hours after their last meal. Rose's death certificate contains the exact same information as to her death as Roger's, except she had an additional brain contusion in the list of injuries to her body. So to summarize, the cause of death of both victims was from the blows to the back of the head, causing acute loss of blood. Someone had stood over the bed and struck them again and again, but no one was sure when they had been killed, what weapon was used, or how the killer had managed to slip away, possibly covered in blood. Initially, investigators attempted to keep some of the information about the cause of death of Roger and Rose under wraps. They would acknowledge only that the victims had died a violent death. On the 15th of September, DCI Supervisor Tim McDonald told the media, quote, "The cause of death has been established, but it would indicate some things we'd rather not have publicly known." They acknowledged that suicide had quickly been ruled out. The injuries suffered by Roger and Rose were similar to each other and were not the type that could be self-inflicted. Neither guns nor drugs were involved. The official police reports list the cause of death as, quote, "blows to the back of the head, causing acute loss of blood." Despite the attempts to keep the cause of death information close to the vest, the press continued to ferret out information about how Rose and Roger died. Dr. Stacy Howell was forced to make a statement. In a September 19, 1980 article in the Cedar Rapids Gazette, he was quoted as saying, "The cause of death was an acute loss of blood. Atkison suffered lacerations of the scalp, skull, and brain, and Burkert sustained lacerations of the scalp and skull and a contusion to the brain. They both had penetrating wounds to the head." In other words, someone had hit Roger and Rose in the backs of their skulls with a sharp, heavy implement sturdy enough to crush and cut open the skulls and damage the brain. The blows had left wounds about 3.5 inches long, crushing and cracking the bones surrounding the cuts. Dr. Howell stated that the wounds were created by, quote, "an instrument strong and sharp enough to penetrate the skull." He noted, quote, "We don't have a murder weapon, but it takes a lot to fracture a skull." The cuts were horizontal to the skull, so that the marks made long, horizontal lines across the backs of the skulls. But Rose had more wounds than Roger. She had 12 blows to the back of her head, while Roger only had 7. And she had injuries to the back of her right shoulder and some scratch marks on her right arm, indicating that perhaps the killer was striking at her and accidentally hitting non-essential body parts. She has one distinctive wound on the back of her left hand near the base of the thumb that is not a cut but left a rectangular impression in the skin with blood on either side, as if she had been struck there with the blunt end of an instrument. Remember that we said that Roger had cuts to his fingers as though he had been struck by the sharp object while his hands were protecting his head from the blows. He had a severed pinky finger on his right hand, 2 deep cuts on that hand, as well as 2 fractures, one on the back of his hand and one on his wrist. He had cuts on the fingers and the back of his left hand as well. His middle finger was nearly detached from his hand. This is all clearly stated and even diagrammed in the autopsy report. In what surely contributed to the conflicting stories and confusing facts about the case, Terry Brosh, the owner of the funeral home in Grand Rapids that had embalmed both victims' bodies, told the St. Joseph News Press that he saw no wounds of a defensive nature and that he did not see any wounds on them beside the head wounds. One has to wonder how closely he was looking and give a mental tip of the cap to the skills of the funeral home's technicians who managed to obscure these wounds. Roger was not raped or sexually abused. A letter to Sheriff William Spurrier from a doctor in St. Joseph named Y.E. Silliman, M.D., states, quote, "Examination of the perineum of the body of Roger E. Atkison shows no marks of violence, no bruising tears or lacerations. No foreign element is evident on the perineum about or within the anus or within the rectum." It's worth noting that this letter was dated September 16th, but the autopsy was on the 14th. It appears that the sheriff requested a special exam to determine whether Roger had been sexually brutalized. Yet, the autopsy of Rose specifically notes that an anal examination was not made, despite notations that indicate that perhaps anal sex had been engaged in. Now for the crucial time of death determination. If you recall, Roger and Rose checked into the hotel at 7:40 p.m. When they died, their stomachs were empty, meaning they were killed at least 4 hours after their last meal. But of course, no one was able to determine when that was. All we have is a rough estimate. According to an expose in the Cedar Rapids Gazette on March 15, 1992, by Rick Smith, Sheriff James Slockett placed the time of death at around midnight. Alfred Hitchcock could not have come up with a better crime scene than this, the retired sheriff said, quoted in the article. Sheriff Rotter.
We don't know exactly the time of this murder. Are we waiting for the hallways to clear? You know, there was a convention going on in the hotel, an undertaker's convention of all things, and the place was packed. So could they have just been waiting out the coast to be a little bit clearer so they could leave? I'm assuming that they have blood on them. They might have been able to wipe it off their skin, but it's got to be on the things they're wearing as well. They have to get out of that hotel without being seen.
And clearly the killer was successful. Let's address what was known about the weapon that was used to kill Roger and Rose. Detectives' notes about the autopsy emphasize that
the wounds did show a consistency of approximately 3½ inches in length. A possible weapon used in the attack is believed to be a hatchet-type instrument.
Paul Holes studied the case extensively. Here he discusses the implement used to kill Roger and Rose.
I think an edged weapon in Rose and Roger's case is the best way to describe it. The types of injuries are entirely consistent with a single-edged weapon that has some weight behind it, such as a hatchet head. In some of Roger and Rose's injuries, in which you have sort of the full length, or I should say the full width, full bladed edged length might be the best way to describe it, inflicted into their skull. You're looking at a bladed weapon that's got about 3½ inches of that single edge. And that's entirely consistent with your typical hatchet.
Days after the murders, the Iowa County Medical Examiner, Dr. Stacy Howell, addressed the media about the ME's findings in the autopsy. Dr. Howell would not commit as to what type of weapon had killed the couple, but contemporary media reports, citing sources close to the investigation, were that the weapon was an axe or hatchet-like instrument. Clearly, someone had leaked the autopsy report to the media. Dr. Howell refused to speculate, saying, "That's been the common rumor, but I don't know the particular reason why it should be a hatchet rather than some other kind of instrument." He did acknowledge that it was probably a bladed instrument. The families were eventually given a number of possibilities as to what instrument had been used to kill their loved ones. Here is Elizabeth Atkison, Roger's sister-in-law.
I'm not sure who told us, but I know they did talk about a machete. It could have been a hatchet. It could have been an axe.
Rita, Roger's sister, recalled that she had been told on Sunday, September 14th, that Roger had been killed with a hatchet or axe. At the time, she thought it was strange that they would have told the families what weapon was used. It was TMI, and an unnamed source who was described as someone close to Rose's family told the St. Joseph News Press, quoted in a September 22, 1980 article, that it was known that Atkison was working as part of a telephone company work crew in northeast Missouri. They usually carry a machete in the event that they have to cut away tall grass from an area where they are working. Perhaps he and Rosie were attacked by someone using his own work knife. DCI agent Richard Gregory is the only investigator who we saw reference another possible weapon having been used, a cleaver. Sheriff Rotter addressed the weapon with us.
No, I can say that you describe it perfectly. It's something like that. I think we've pretty much ruled out that it's anything too terribly heavy like an axe or anything, because the damage to the skulls was, while not completely superficial, there's a lot of superficial injuries, but there's also injuries that involve the impact in the skull and the fracturing of the skull, but not to the point of something very, very heavy. It wouldn't take much if you swung a machete at someone's head to crack the skull. So I think it's something along those lines, something on the lighter side, something that can be swung quickly, whether it's a machete or a hatchet. Somebody pointed out that there would be a crating. It was called a crating hammer that looks a little bit like a hatchet on one side and a hammer on the other. Could it be something like that? Could it be a roofer's tool that they used to use for roofing?
Whatever weapon was used by the killer, it was not found in room 260 or anywhere. Whoever had done this had brought along the instrument used to kill Rose and Roger. At first, investigators considered the possibility that the killing was not planned and the murderer had used something on hand. This was partially because it seemed unlikely that the killer had sauntered into the hotel with a hatchet, roofer's knife, machete, or similar tool hidden on his person. It was early September and still hot, an average of 84 degrees that week, so no coat would be worn. As Paul Holes bluntly put it,
if he was carrying a hatchet, that would stand out.
Of course, it was a hotel. The killer could have been carrying a bag with a weapon inside it and not raised any eyebrows. But investigators noted that the hotel, being dedicated to the historic Amish farming motif, was decorated with old-timey farm implements and tools, which lined some of its walls. Here is Paul Holes.
In many ways, I would liken it almost to a medieval look with all these old, farming implements, notably implements such, that are like hand tools that were hanging on the wall when people would walk into the lobby.
Could the killer have simply used one of these, plucked off the wall in the middle of the night unnoticed, and replaced it after use, leaving the murderous implement right under the very eyes of investigators? Tim Trishman says not likely.
The motif for the hotel, the Amana Colonies, was a very tourist attraction, and there were many, hundreds of different kinds of old farm tools, small implements, for instance, cigar presses, all sorts of things that lined the walls and the lobby area. So many of them. So was there anything sharp that could have been involved in this? Right offhand, I don't think so, or wouldn't have been accessible, because many of the things were fastened to walls. And I believe at some point in time we were questioned that and did a kind of an inventory. Didn't find anything missing, and certainly nothing that would constitute a weapon. Just in the main lobby area by the front desk, the hallway going to the restaurant, and then the hallway adjacent to the indoor pool.
Rob Rotter has insight on what exactly was done by law enforcement to determine whether any of these weapons could have been utilized by the killer.
The decor of the hotel at one time was it was made to look like you were inside a barn. And if you look at the building, it's actually built to look like a barn, an old Amana Colony's barn. And so one of the things that they decorated the interior was old farm implements, old hand tools. And so one of the ideas that came up along the way was, is it possible that the murder weapon wasn't brought into the hotel because it was already there? Was it one of these tools that was hanging on the walls? And these things were hanging throughout the hotel. So they actually did look at those and test for blood and see if any one of them had looked like they'd been used. And they actually took pictures of some of the blades, because there are definitely bladed tools, no question. Were they used? Did they match any of the wounds? Was there blood stains on any of them? They never did find anything like that, but it just goes to show that those types of injuries could be caused by a whole list of implements, and so it's really hard to say what it was.
This leaves only two possibilities for the weapon. Either it was something that was commonly carried by the person who used it, say a tradesman or laborer who happened to have it on him when he committed the murders, or the killer had deliberately selected and brought the tool with him, intending to use it to kill. This concludes episode 1. Please join us next week as we delve into the crime scene investigation. If you have any information about the murders of Roger Atkison and Rose Berkert, please contact the Iowa County Sheriff's Office at 319-642-7307. Scene of the Crime is a production of AbJack Entertainment. It's narrated by me, Jamie Rice, and co-produced by Jessica Betancourt, Gray Hughes, and Mike Morford. It's written by Jessica Betancourt. Special thanks goes out to the family members and friends of Roger Atkison and Rose Berkert who participated in this podcast. Thanks also goes out to Sheriff Rob Rotter and the Iowa County Sheriff's Department, Paul Holes, Ron Fisher, Tim Trishman, and Ida Block. If you'd like to help Scene of the Crime reach new listeners, be sure to subscribe to the show and leave a 5-star rating and review wherever you listen to your podcasts. And please recommend this podcast to your friends. You can find Scene of the Crime on Twitter at Scene of Crime Pod and on Facebook.